The grandmother stood behind the counter of her bookstore, watching dust motes float through the afternoon light. At 78, her hands shook when she lifted the heavy volumes, and her knees protested every trip up the ladder. The store had been in her family for 4 generations, but now it was dying. She heard the bell above the door chime. Her granddaughter walked in, dragging a suitcase behind her. The young woman looked defeated. Her cocktail bar in the city had failed, leaving her drowning in debt. She had nowhere else to go. "The store looks worse than I remembered," the granddaughter said, not bothering with a proper greeting. The grandmother didn't respond. She was used to her granddaughter's sharp tongue. The girl had always thought the bookstore was a waste of time, a relic that should have been sold years ago. They worked in uncomfortable silence for 3 days before the bank notice arrived. Foreclosure in 30 days. The grandmother's hands trembled as she read the amount owed more money than the store had made in the last 5 years combined. "We're finished," the grandmother said quietly. The granddaughter grabbed the notice, her face going pale. "There has to be something. Insurance? Savings? Anything?" "Nothing," the grandmother replied. "I've already borrowed against everything." The granddaughter tore through the office that night, desperate. Behind an old photograph, she found a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside was a metal box, heavy with age. She called for her grandmother. Inside the box were pages, original manuscript pages from a famous author who had disappeared decades ago. These pages alone could be worth millions, but underneath them were letters. Old letters written in her great-great-grandfather's hand. The grandmother read them first, her face growing ashen. "What is it?" the granddaughter demanded. The letters told an ugly story. The bookstore's founder, the grandmother's own grandfather, had cheated a desperate writer named Thomas Vance out of his manuscript. The man had come begging for help, addicted to opium and starving. Instead of helping him, the founder had gotten him to sign over all rights to his work for almost nothing. The writer had killed himself 3 months later, leaving behind a 7-year-old daughter. "This changes nothing," the granddaughter said immediately. "That was over 100 years ago. We need this money now." The grandmother sat heavily in her chair. "I always wondered," she whispered. "My mother used to have nightmares. She'd wake up screaming about a man at the window. She said the store was cursed." "Curses aren't real. Foreclosure is." The granddaughter had already contacted an auction house. The representative arrived the next morning, a thin man with eager eyes. He examined the pages with gloved hands. "These are authentic," he breathed. "The lost Vance manuscript. This will cause a sensation. I can guarantee at least $3 million at auction, possibly more." The grandmother watched from her chair, saying nothing. That night, the granddaughter found her grandmother on the floor of the store, surrounded by books she'd pulled from the shelves. She was crying. "What are you doing?" Looking for more of his work. There might be more hidden pages. But what the grandmother found instead was a journal, her own mother's journal. The pages detailed years of guilt, of seeing Thomas Vance's daughter begging on street corners, of trying to help her secretly but being forbidden by her father. The final entry was dated the day before her mother's suicide. "She killed herself because of this," the grandmother said. "The guilt destroyed her." The granddaughter's hands shook as she read. "You never told me she killed herself." "I was 8 years old. They told me she had a weak heart." The grandmother insisted they find Vance's descendants. The granddaughter resisted. What good would it do? But the old woman threatened to burn the manuscript if they didn't try. It took 2 weeks of searching through records, but the granddaughter found them. Thomas Vance's great-great-granddaughter lived in Kentucky, working 3 jobs to pay for her father's cancer treatment. She had a daughter, 16, who had just won a writing contest but couldn't afford to go to the award ceremony. The grandmother called them. "I know about the manuscript," the woman said quietly. "My grandmother told me the story before she died. She said a bookstore man stole her father's life's work." "We want to make it right," the grandmother said. "You want to clear your conscience before you profit from it," the woman corrected. The granddaughter proposed a solution. Publish the manuscript properly, with Thomas Vance's name on it. Split the profits. It seemed fair. But when they met with a publisher, they learned something that changed everything. The manuscript was incomplete. The ending, the last 50 pages, was missing. Without it, the manuscript's value dropped to almost nothing. "Maybe $50,000, the publisher said. "Not enough to save the store. There must be more pages hidden somewhere," the granddaughter said desperately. They searched for days. Nothing. Then the woman from Kentucky called. "I have something you should know," she said. "My grandmother kept papers too, including the real ending. Thomas Vance gave it to her before he died, told her to keep it safe, that someday it would be worth something." "We'll buy it from you," the granddaughter said immediately. "It's not for sale." The woman's voice was cold. "But I'll make you a deal." The woman from Kentucky arrived 3 days later with her daughter. She was younger than expected, tired-looking but with sharp, intelligent eyes. Her daughter looked like a young version of the grandmother, the same determined set to her jaw. "Here's my offer," the woman said. "I'll give you the ending. You can sell the complete manuscript and save your store. In exchange, you sign over half ownership of the bookstore to my daughter when she turns 18. She wants to be a writer. She needs a place to write, to learn the business." The granddaughter exploded. "That's extortion." That's justice, the woman replied calmly. Your family built this store on my family's bones. Now my daughter will own part of what should have been ours. The grandmother was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, What's your daughter's name? Emma Vance. The grandmother looked at the girl. Can you run a register? I can learn. Can you climb a ladder? Better than you, probably. The girl's voice was bold but not unkind. The grandmother almost smiled. What do you write? Stories about girls who save themselves. They were about to agree when the auction house representative returned. He had news. Another manuscript had surfaced, another supposedly lost Vance work, then another. Investigation revealed that the grandmother's grandfather hadn't just stolen from Thomas Vance. He'd done this to at least 12 writers over 30 years. The bookstore's entire foundation was built on theft. If this becomes public, you won't just lose the store, the representative warned. You could face lawsuits from all their descendants. The granddaughter wanted to hide everything, destroy the evidence, but the grandmother had already made copies of all the letters, all the proof. She'd sent them to a lawyer. I won't live much longer, she said. I won't die carrying this. The woman from Kentucky made a new offer. We handle this quietly. Set up a foundation for struggling writers. The bookstore continues but pays into the foundation permanently. 50% of all profits, forever, and my daughter still gets her partnership when she's 18. That's impossible, the granddaughter said. We'll never make enough money to survive on half the profits. Then you'll have to work harder, or smarter, or both. They signed the agreement on a rainy Thursday. The manuscript sold for $2 million, enough to save the store, but not enough to make anyone rich. After taxes and the initial foundation setup, they had just enough to keep the doors open for another year. The grandmother trained Emma Vance every weekend. The girl was quick, sharp, and had her ancestor's way with words. She also had his temper. She and the granddaughter fought constantly. She's insufferable, the granddaughter complained. She's 16, the grandmother replied. And she's family now, whether we like it or not. The store changed. They couldn't afford to keep all the inventory, so they specialized rare books and local authors only. The granddaughter started a coffee bar in the corner, using her bartending skills. Emma started a writing workshop for teenagers, charging enough to cover the foundation payments. It worked, barely. They scraped by month to month. The grandmother's health declined. She could no longer climb the ladders at all. Emma took over that job, complaining loudly but doing it anyway. 6 months later, the grandmother found Emma in the office, reading the old letters. He was brilliant, Emma said about Thomas Vance, but also weak. Most people are both, the grandmother replied. Your grandfather was just weak, Emma said bluntly. The grandmother didn't argue. Probably. Emma held up a letter they hadn't seen before. But this one's interesting. Your grandfather's son, your father, tried to find my family. He wanted to give the manuscript back. Your grandfather stopped him. The grandmother took the letter with trembling hands. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable. He'd known. He'd tried to make it right and failed. So it wasn't all of you, Emma said. Just most of you. That night, the grandmother had a stroke. The grandmother survived but couldn't speak clearly anymore. She could write, slowly and painfully. The granddaughter and Emma ran the store together, their dislike for each other obvious but manageable. One day, a year later, the granddaughter found the grandmother trying to write something. It took her 20 minutes to complete one sentence. The store is yours now. Both of ours, you mean? The granddaughter said, glancing at Emma. The grandmother shook her head and pointed at Emma. That's not the agreement, the granddaughter protested. The grandmother wrote again, even more slowly. My will, already done. The granddaughter was furious. She'd given up everything for this store, and now it would belong to a stranger's descendant. But the will was legal and ironclad. When the grandmother died, Emma would inherit her shares. With the partnership agreement, that would give Emma majority control when she turned 18 in 3 months. I don't want it all, Emma said quietly. Just what's fair. Fair, the granddaughter laughed bitterly. Nothing about this is fair. The grandmother died on a Tuesday morning, holding an old photograph of the original bookstore. The granddaughter and Emma found her together, having come in early to argue about inventory. After the funeral, they discovered one last secret. The grandmother had been in contact with all the descendants of the cheated writers. She'd been sending them money, her own savings, her social security, everything she had. She'd been doing it for 30 years, ever since she'd first suspected the truth. She'd lived in near poverty to pay for her grandfather's crimes. She never told me, the granddaughter whispered. She was ashamed, Emma said, but she did something about it. That's more than most people would do. The bookstore's accounts were even worse than they'd thought. The grandmother had been keeping it afloat with her pension. Without that, they had maybe 2 months before bankruptcy. We could sell the building, the granddaughter said. Take what we can get and walk away. Emma looked around the store. Is that what you want? I want to stop paying for things I didn't do. But you benefited from them. They stood among the stacks of books, 2 young women bound together by other people's sins. They didn't sell. Instead, they transformed the store completely. Emma's writing workshops expanded into a full program. The granddaughter turned the coffee bar into a proper cafe that served alcohol in the evenings. They hosted readings, charging admission. They sold online, learning the digital market together despite their mutual resentment. The foundation continued to take its 50%, but they were making more money now. Not enough to get rich, never that, but enough to survive. Emma turned 18 and took her majority share. Her first decision was to keep the granddaughter as a full partner. Why? The granddaughter asked, suspicious. Because you're good at this, and because I think Thomas Vance would have wanted it this way. He was a drunk and an addict, but he was also kind. My great-great-grandmother's letters say so. 3 months after the funeral, they found another hidden space while renovating the cafe area. Behind a false wall was a tiny room, barely large enough for a desk and chair. It was filled with notebooks, the grandmother's handwriting covering thousands of pages. The granddaughter sat on the dusty floor, reading. These weren't just records of payments to the descendants. They were investigations. The grandmother had spent decades researching each cheated writer, learning their stories, their families, their dreams that had been stolen. She was obsessed, Emma said, reading over her shoulder. One notebook was different. It detailed the grandmother's own father, the man who had tried to return the manuscript. He hadn't just tried once. He'd tried for 20 years, fought his own father, nearly destroyed the family business, trying to make amends. He died believing he had failed. But he hadn't completely failed, the granddaughter realized, pointing to a faded receipt. Look, he managed to send money to Thomas Vance's daughter. Monthly payments for 15 years, hidden in the store's accounts as inventory losses. Emma found more evidence. 3 generations had known. 3 generations had tried, in their own ways, to make it right. And 3 generations had failed, but each had failed a little less than the one before. We're not the first to carry this, Emma said quietly. No, we're just the first to do it openly. They found something else in that room, a letter the grandmother had written but never sent, addressed to both of them. Her handwriting was shaky, dated just a week before her stroke. I know you two will never love each other. That's fine. Love isn't necessary for what you need to do. What's necessary is understanding that some wounds don't heal. They just pass from one generation to the next, changing shape but never disappearing. The bookstore isn't a business. It's a confession that must be maintained, a debt that must be acknowledged daily. I'm sorry to leave you with this burden, but I'm also grateful that you're strong enough to carry it. 10 years passed. The granddaughter was 40 now, Emma 28. They had developed a rhythm, not friendship, but a functional partnership built on mutual necessity and grudging respect. The store's transformation had attracted attention. A journalist came to write about the bookstore built on guilt. The granddaughter wanted to refuse the interview, but Emma insisted on transparency. Our shame is our strength, Emma said. If we hide it, we become like them. The article brought unexpected consequences. Some people boycotted them, calling them performative and self-serving. Others came specifically to support them, drawn to the brutal honesty of their mission. But most disturbing were the letters from other bookstore owners, other family businesses, confessing their own dark foundations. Everyone has something, the granddaughter said, reading the 20th such letter. Not everyone tries to fix it, Emma replied. One letter was different. It came from a law firm representing the estate of another cheated writer, one they hadn't known about. The firm wasn't seeking money. They wanted to donate the writer's remaining manuscripts to the store, to be sold or displayed as you see fit, with proceeds going to your foundation. Inside the box of manuscripts was a note from the writer's elderly daughter. I'm 93 years old. I've hated your family my entire life. But hate is heavy, and I'm tired of carrying it. Do better. They worked together for 40 more years. They never became friends, exactly, but they became something else, co-conspirators in an impossible redemption. The store survived, even thrived in its way. Writers were helped. Debts were paid, though they could never be fully cleared. 25 years after the grandmother's death, when the granddaughter was 65 and Emma 55, both gray-haired and worn by decades of difficult work, a young woman appeared at the store. She was perhaps 30, well-dressed, with an expensive leather briefcase. I'm Thomas Vance's great-great-great-granddaughter, she announced. The other side of the family, the one that didn't stay in Kentucky. Emma tensed. What do you want? To thank you. The woman pulled out a worn notebook. This was my grandmother's. She kept track of every payment your grandmother sent, every penny, for 30 years. It paid for my mother's education. My mother became a doctor. She paid for my education. I'm a lawyer now. The granddaughter's hands trembled. We didn't know there was another branch of the family. There are many branches, the woman said. Some of us fell into poverty. Some of us climbed out. But we all knew the story. We all knew about the bookstore that stole from us, and the women who tried to pay it back. She set a check on the counter. It was for $1 million. I don't understand, Emma said. Thomas Vance's manuscript wasn't his only work. We've found others legitimately ours. They're being published next year. This is an advance on the royalties. We, the descendants, voted. We want to invest in the bookstore. Not out of forgiveness, that's not ours to give. but out of understanding that you've become what our ancestor was, people who create despite the weight of the past. The granddaughter pushed the check back. We can't accept this. You have to, the woman said firmly, because this isn't charity, it's an investment. We want 50% ownership of the store, the same deal Emma got, but in reverse. Emma laughed bitterly. So we'd be working for the Vance family. With the Vance family, the woman corrected, my condition is this. The store becomes a true collective. Every writer we've helped through the foundation gets a small share. Every employee, every person connected to this long, ugly history becomes part owner. No one owns enough to control it. Everyone owns enough to care. That's insane, the granddaughter said. That's justice, the woman replied. Messy, complicated, unsatisfying justice. Emma heard the whispered words and didn't turn immediately. She kept her eyes on the chaotic room, a strange collection of humanity bound by a single, fraying thread. They were artists, thinkers, and dreamers, but they were not business people. She had known this would be difficult, but the sheer velocity of the descent into anarchy was breathtaking. The argument over coffee had devolved into a philosophical debate on the ethics of caffeine sourcing, which then spiraled into 3 separate monologues on colonialism. Finally, she turned to the granddaughter. You're wrong, she said, her voice low but firm, a surprising counterpoint to the granddaughter's weary surrender. The granddaughter looked at her, eyebrows raised in disbelief. Wrong? Are you listening to them? That man? She gestured with her chin towards the elderly poet, who was now gesticulating wildly about the acoustic properties of the ceiling, believes that profit is a bourgeois poison. The woman over there, she indicated the young novelist, who was furiously typing on her phone, thinks physical books are relics and wants to replace the shelves with QR codes. How do you build a bridge between those two positions? You don't, Emma replied, taking a sip of the terrible coffee everyone had finally begrudgingly agreed upon. You build something new in the chasm between them. Look, a year ago, you and I were in courtrooms trying to destroy each other. We both wanted this place, but for entirely different reasons. We fought over every comma in every document, and yet, here we are, on the same side. If we can stand in the same room without calling our lawyers, anything is possible. The granddaughter considered this. The raw truth of it was undeniable. The animosity between their families, the Vances and the Sterlings, was legendary. Yet the founders' bizarre final will had forced them into this shotgun marriage of a cooperative. Losing the store to a corporate chain was the one thing they both feared more than each other. That was different. The granddaughter argued, though with less conviction. That was about preservation. This is about creation, and everyone has a different blueprint. The next few weeks proved her point with excruciating clarity. The collective operated not as a single entity, but as 43 warring city-states. Decisions were made by committee, and since a committee for everything was impractical, nothing was decided at all. The store's staff, caught in the crossfire of contradictory instructions, grew demoralized. One morning, they were told to create a Zen reading garden in the nonfiction aisle. By the afternoon, they were ordered to clear the same space for a pop-up digital art installation. Sales plummeted. The regulars who had loved the store for its quiet, curated atmosphere were alienated by the constant, jarring changes. New customers were confused. The store had no identity anymore. It was a blank canvas that a dozen people were trying to paint on at the same time, resulting in a murky, indecipherable brown. The crisis came during the quarterly financial review. The accountant, a dry man who had seen the store through decades of stability, presented the numbers without emotion. They were catastrophic. The store was bleeding money at an unsustainable rate. He gave them 6 months, maybe 8, if they stopped buying new stock immediately. The news fell like a shroud over the collective. The passionate arguments ceased, replaced by a stunned, fearful silence. The elderly poet looked frail. The young novelist looked pale. The reality of spreadsheets and bottom lines had crashed their beautiful, abstract party. That evening, long after the others had shuffled out, their heads hung low, Emma and the granddaughter sat alone in the shuttered bookstore. The silence was heavy, filled with the scent of old paper and new failure. So, you were right, Emma said quietly, breaking the stillness. This isn't working. The granddaughter didn't look triumphant. She just looked tired. I didn't want to be right, she confessed. My grandmother loved this place. I fought for it because of her. I feel like I'm letting her down. My grandfather built this place with his own hands, Emma countered softly. He believed books could save the world. He would have hated all of this. She swept her hand around the chaotic room, but he would have hated seeing the doors close even more. They sat for another moment. It was in that shared space of potential loss, of failing the legacies they carried, that a new understanding formed. They were the two largest single shareholders. They were the opposing poles that held the entire enterprise together. If they couldn't lead, no one would. We need a plan, the granddaughter said, her voice shifting from resigned to resolute. A real one, not a poem or a manifesto, a business plan. And we need to sell it to them, Emma added, catching the spark. Not as a surrender of their ideals, but as the only way to give those ideals a home. They worked for the next 2 weeks, fueled by coffee and a desperate, shared purpose. They hammered out a constitution, a document that was both a business strategy and a peace treaty. They didn't try to build a bridge between the poet and the novelist. They gave them each their own distinct territory. The proposal was simple, yet radical. The bookstore would be divided. The physical space would be a haven for print, a celebration of the tangible book. It would host readings, workshops, and quiet corners for study, appeasing the traditionalists. The elderly poet would be given a budget and a mandate to run a monthly live performance series, Poetry and Prose Alive. Simultaneously, they would invest a significant portion of their remaining capital into a world-class website and online sales portal. It would become a digital hub for the writers in the collective, featuring blogs, exclusive ebooks, and online courses. The young novelist would be tasked with leading the digital strategy team. Every other aspect of the business was defined with stark clarity. Budgets were set, roles were defined, and a small 3-person management board was proposed to handle day-to-day decisions. The board would consist of 1 Vance, 1 Sterling, and 1 elected member from the remaining 50%. They called another all-hands meeting. The mood was funereal as they gathered. The granddaughter stood before them, not with a spreadsheet, but with a story. She spoke of her grandmother's love for the feel of a book. Emma spoke after her, telling them of her grandfather's dream of ideas spreading beyond the confines of brick and mortar. Then they presented the plan. They laid out the harsh financial truths and then offered their detailed, 2-pronged solution. It wasn't a perfect dream for anyone, but it was a tangible reality for everyone. It offered survival. The debate that followed was tense, but different from the chaos of before. It was focused. People asked hard questions about budgets and timelines. They argued over details, but not over the core concept. For the first time, they were not fighting for their own individual vision. They were negotiating for their collective future. When the vote was called, it was a simple show of hands. The granddaughter and Emma raised theirs first. Then, slowly, hands went up around the room. The poet, the novelist, the historian, the biographer. Not everyone, but more than enough. The motion passed. A wave of relief washed over the room, so palpable it was almost a sound. As the meeting broke up, the granddaughter found Emma by the shelves. That was harder than any board meeting I've ever been in, she said, a hint of a smile on her face. It was, Emma agreed. But look, she nodded towards the huddles of people around the room. The poet was in an animated conversation with the novelist, not arguing, but planning. Others were talking, sketching ideas on napkins, the energy of creation returning, but this time with direction. Maybe, the granddaughter said, her eyes sweeping over the room, the messy, difficult, impossible family they had inherited. Maybe this will work after all. It's not supposed to work smoothly, Emma replied. It's supposed to be honest. Somehow, they found a way forward. Decisions were slow, compromises unsatisfying, but they were real. For the first time in its history, the bookstore truly belonged to the community it claimed to serve. The woman from the Vance family, her name was Sarah, they learned, worked in the store 1 day a week, despite being a successful lawyer. She said she needed to understand the weight of the place. My great-great-great-grandfather died in the apartment above this store, she said one evening, helping the granddaughter close up. He was trying to get his manuscript back. Your ancestor had him thrown out. He collapsed on the street outside. The granddaughter said nothing. What could she say? I don't hate you, Sarah continued, but I'll never not see his ghost when I look at you. I know, the granddaughter replied. I see him too.